It's May 13th. I'm asking everyone to participate today and mute yourself. So I hope you're all well, and I'm glad you've come to our second Zoom meeting, and we'll see how it goes today. So you have a little button, and I see that everyone has pressed that. Thank you so much. So you received an email telling you about this Zoom meeting, but besides the address for our Zoom meeting, there's other information for you to access. I think a particular interest is the Rotary Climate Action Committee did a report and a preview of the kind of work they are doing. This committee is really sending the word out to Rotarians and their guests throughout the Bay Area, and they're starting to expand on all the things we can do as individuals to combat climate change. So I really recommend that report to you, and you can just click onto the email. This committee is also currently doing an integration effort with Rotary International Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group. So I think what we have started here with our club is quickly going to be spreading around the world in a very positive way. So I highly recommend that committee report. Also, past President Carl Silker did a nice little video report you can click on about our San Jose Rotary Club Flickr page. So I commend that to you too. There are two new member introductions, Maria Mendoza and Tassion's is also, it dropped off one of our emails last week, so I added that to this week. So there are 4 bonus videos for you to enjoy at your leisure during this week. Now, I do have a report for you from the Rotacare Committee. Rose Simmons, take it away.
Thank you, President Karen, for the opportunity to share some brief information regarding Rotary's Rotacare Committee. I am Rose Simmons, and I'm the chair of this committee. The Rotacare Committee supports the efforts of the Rotacare Clinic. The clinic was started as a service project in 1989 by Dr. Mark Campbell and District Governor John Fisher. The 10 Rotacare clinics across the Bay Area have treated thousands of patients. Each patient treated would have otherwise gone without medical care. The San Jose Clinic provides non-emergency medical care every Wednesday evening at the Washington Elementary School, 100 Oak Street, San Jose. The clinic provides free medical care to people with the greatest need and the least access to health care. Patients are a mix of repeats and first-timers with a variety of medical conditions, including diabetes, hypertension, etc. The clinic is often referred to, quote, as a safety net for safety nets, end of quote. I'd like to share with you a quote from a patient. You are all good people at the clinic, like angels. You help us who are in need, end of quote. The clinic operates through the humanitarian efforts of volunteer Rotarians, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and support staff. The clinic employs a part-time operations manager. The Rotacare Committee supports the clinic in the following ways. Applying and managing Rotary's very generous annual grant to the clinic. Thank you, Rotary, for your ongoing support. Recruiting restaurants for dinner for the clinic volunteers. Most of them come directly from work to the clinic. The following restaurants donate dinners for clinic volunteers. They are Cafe Stritch, Palermo's, Tomato Time, Giorgio's, Aki and Willow Glen, Los Gatos Cafe, and the Loaves and Fishes program. During COVID-19, please support these restaurants when you are in the market for takeout food and give them a big thank you for providing food for the clinic. The committee recruits volunteers, picks up and delivers donated dinners to the clinic volunteer staff, hosts a volunteer recognition event in partnership with the Hospitality Committee, hosts a donor recognition, hosts clinic site visits, and promotes the clinic in the community. I'm very proud to share that on February 13th, the clinic was recognized at the Stanford Medicine 18th Annual Community Health Symposium and received the Outstanding Partner Award for group and individual intervention programs for Latina women with depression. As President Karen mentioned on April 29th Rotary Zoom call, the clinic has been closed due to COVID-19 since March 17th. Once we are up and running again, the committee will resume active support to the clinic. Special shout out to Rotary Committee, Brad Barron and Candace Rooney, longtime Rotary leaders, Dave Markham, past chair of this committee for 8 years, Devin Conway, coordinator of our weekly restaurant donations, Terry Austin for developing and designing dashboard metrics, and committee members, Karen Philbrick, Julie Shaver, Michael Oliver, Leah Schooner, and David Davis. Once we are up and running again, we invite you for a clinic visit. Also to join our committee or help in some way. Please feel free to contact me. Thank you, President Karen. Thank you, President Karen, for the opportunity to share some brief information regarding Rotary's Rotary Committee. I am Rose Simmons, and I'm the chair of this committee. The Rotary Committee supports the efforts of the Rotary Clinic. The clinic was started as a service project. Thank you, President Karen, for the opportunity to.
Okay, my apologies. Thank you very much, Rose. And we are very impressed at the work that the Rotary Committee does. I would like you to send your volunteer hours to Bonnie Bamberg at the Gmail address that you can see below, bbamberg0@gmail.com. Please send her your committee work hours, your individual work hours that you are doing now in the community, and the hours you put into your committee meetings. We had a goal this year of doing 8,000 volunteer Rotary hours, and I believe we are going to make that goal. Now, before we have our speaker, let's just see what some of our Rotarians are doing. First of all, I would like to congratulate Rod Deardon Sr. for 49 years membership with this club as of May 4th. Congratulations, Rod. You are a fabulous member and you have added such value to our club throughout your 49 years. You must have joined when you were about 1 year old. Let's wish a speedy recovery and well wishes to Bob Keeve. Bob has had a problem with one of his legs. He has a little bit of edema. He's in the hospital being tested now. So I spoke to him a few days ago and he was in very good spirits, but we all wish him a speedy recovery. On May 7th in Spotlight, an online newspaper, there's an article by Karen Philbrick, who is the executive director of the Magnetic Transportation Institute. It's a very nice article commending transit workers who put their lives on the line for all of us. So I recommend that May 7th article to you. Now, last week, Jeffrey Poley showed us his sidewalk art, but now here's an actual picture of his neighborhood. And I don't know about their social distancing because this artwork is attracting so many people to look at it. So way to go, Jeffrey, but you might put signs up about social distancing. Now, Gay Crawford has sent us a video today that shows you how you can make your own masks. So please take a listen to this.
Hi, President Karen. It's Gay Crawford, and as you know, this Mother's Day weekend, we didn't have courageous kids. So after 30 years of being out at Great America for Mother's Day, I'm a little bit in mourning. But I did find a perfect mask, and here I am with my perfect attendance pin, and I'm going to try to show you how to do it. You take a perfectly nice pair of men's underwear, thank you, Roy, and you put your head like so. You take it, you try to twist it around, and there you go.
Gay, I really don't know what to say.
Hi, President Karen.
Now, last week we had a mystery Rotarian with a mask on, and there he is on the left, and no one guessed Frank Beal. So the hat is going to go to Frank. And I was surprised that no one was able to get him, but Frank, that will be going to you. Now, this week's mystery Rotarian is here. And I'm going to give you a clue this week because you all did so poorly last week. This week's Rotarian is an artist. So I want to know if you can guess who these people are. And if you guess correctly, you get a hat. And here's a clue. Also, these people in front of their house, that might help you too. The artist, here we go. I look forward to a text or an email, and I will look at the time. And I was taking a walk earlier this week, and look who I ran into, President-elect Fernando and his wife. Now, I have two bits of news from Dan Polcrano. One, in the Metro running May 6th to 12th, there's a great article about the 1918 pandemic flu. So I invite you to enjoy that article. It's absolutely excellent. But on really good news, and Dan kind of gave us a preview earlier, look at little Sophia. Dan's going to get a silver spoon, but she is beautiful. Coming to Santa Clara County on May 9th, weighing 5 pounds, 8 ounces. What a beauty. And finally, I'm very upset to report that I have discovered that Joe Sweeney has actually forged a Rotary badge. He made it purple, thinking that he's somewhere between a red badger and a blue badger. This is very upsetting. And again, I'll bring this to Jeff Rosen's attention when he speaks to us. But there has been a sighting of Joe Sweeney's blue badge, and it was at the California Sports Center. That's where it was last seen, near the rings. So, Joe, we are still trying to get it, but you don't need to do any more forgeries. So that's the news on what Rotarians are doing right now. And with that, I'm going to ask David Ginsburg to introduce our speaker, Frank Pine. Thank you very much. And next week, before I stop this screen, next week, please know that our speaker will be Tim Camus, and he will be speaking about IRS impersonation scams. And if you have questions after Frank speaks, please send it to me through chat, not to everyone, but to me, and then I will ask Frank the questions. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to see you all at our Zoom meeting today, May 13th.
Well, it must be Wednesday. Thank goodness for Rotary. Otherwise, I would never know what day it is. And thank goodness for Karen, Sean, Leslie, and all the people who make these Rotary meetings such a big success. and welcome to new members, Dazan and Maria. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Frank Pine. While his most important responsibility is as a newlywed and father of a college student, now studying from home, that college student, Frank is balancing that with his weighty responsibility for overseeing the editorial strategy and senior personnel at the San Jose Mercury News and the East Bay Times. He has never stayed too far from his journalism roots, which stretched back to 1996 when he kicked off his career writing for the Inland Valley Daily Bulletin. As a reporter and in his early days as an editor, he was dogged in the much-needed pursuit of opening up government. In the early 2000s, he even took the chair of the San Bernardino Board of Supervisors, Bill Postmus, to court, demanding that they open the government to the public. The result? Frank was promoted, and Postmus eventually went to jail for corruption. Possessing a tremendous work ethic in addition to his vast responsibilities at the Bay Area News Group, Frank also spends his extra time, listen to this, doing the same job for the Southern California News Group, which consists of 11 dailies, including the Orange County Register, Press Enterprise, and Los Angeles Daily News.
Good.
With a combined monthly web traffic,
watching a Zoom.
with a combined monthly web traffic exceeding 45 million users in April and a Sunday print circulation over 800,000, I'm very pleased to introduce the man with his finger on the pulse of news media and readers throughout California. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to Frank Pine. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can you guys all see the first slide there?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, is it the right one with just the slide, or is it the one with the notes?
It's the
With
slide.
the notes.
It's the slide
Oh, yeah.
with notes on the side.
All right, hang on one second here.
That's just the slide.
All right, now it's right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the state of the fourth estate. And when I talk about the fourth estate, I really mean journalism in the United States today. I'm going to start out by giving you a quick history of news in the United States and then work my way into basically the state of journalism at the beginning of the, well, not really the beginning of the 21st century, in 2020. So to begin with, when we talk about the state, we tend to think of it as a pillar of democracy and the responsibility of journalism to hold government accountable to the people, to ensure that the citizenry is well informed, and of course to promote public discourse. Equally important, though, is the need to inform, to entertain people, and to create a sense of community through a shared set of facts, right? It is only by having that common set of facts that we're able to have a very thoughtful public discourse and to execute our civic responsibility and ensure good government at the polling place. In the early days of newspapers, news organizations were really fell into two categories. Some of them were highly political, and they tended to be owned by wealthy individuals who had a point of view that they wanted to express and share, while others were really mercantile publications that had ship schedules, commodity pricing, and so forth. The first American newspapers, which were in the colonial area, were small publications that were very outspoken. The one that you see here on this slide is the Boston Gazette, which was actually the third newspaper invented in the United States, or founded in the United States, and it was the first to be branded an enemy of the state, that by the King of England. The Boston Gazette was the place where the Sons of Liberty met and prepared for the Boston Tea Party. The flag, which is what you see at the top of the page there, was designed by Paul Revere, and Samuel Adams was a regular contributor to the Boston Gazette. So it gives you a sense of where newspapers started in the United States. Highly political, very, very oriented toward persuasive arguments, and in this case, this newspaper is probably one of the most influential in the history of our nation. In the 19th century, advances in technology allowed people to, allowed publishers to mass produce newspapers more cheaply, which led to what is called the penny press. The Boston Gazette never had a circulation of more than 700 or 800. Once steam-powered printing was invented in about the middle of the 19th century, publishers were able to print thousands of newspapers out, which fundamentally changed the dynamics of the newspaper business model, right? So suddenly you could make them a lot cheaper, you could sell them more in bulk, and as this happened, there was a shift in the content modeling. As newspapers tried to appeal to a broader audience, they took on a more general approach to news. Essentially, they became less political as they were trying to sell to a broader group of people. In the 20th century, forgive the typo on my slide. In the 20th century, new technology allowed publishers to mass produce newspapers even more cheaply, and also the industrialization and the invention of the automobile allowed them to reach much larger audiences. This was also the period of corporatization of media, where newspapers became owned. There was consolidation of the industry. Newspapers became owned by corporate chains, and so you had an even greater push toward objective journalism, less partisan journalism, which eventually brings us to the heyday of American newspapers, right? The modern U.S. newspaper. And this is probably the newspaper that you were all familiar with and that you feel like you grew up with, right? So the modern U.S. newspaper is basically where the advertising model was born. Typically, it had 5 sections. There was the main news section, which is the A section, which you see there on the left. There was a local news section. Then there was some sort of features section. What you see here is Eat, Drink, Play from the Mercury News. But feature sections also included food sections, fashion sections, kids sections, health sections, etc. And then, of course, there was sports, and finally there was classified. Now, this is the newspaper as we commonly know it, and the business model of this newspaper was based heavily on advertising, and there was a lot of advertising to be had in these newspapers. In fact, a lot of those feature sections were based on the fact that advertisers wanted to be associated with that type of content. So when you had a food section, for example, you'd have a lot of supermarket advertising and other related advertising that went along with that content. The same thing applied to like a fashion section, or even the entertainment section, where you might have had advertising, a lot more advertising related to movies, concerts, events, and so forth. But the most important part of that modern newspaper was that classified section, where the advertising was sold by the line, right? So those classified sections were incredibly lucrative. In fact, one publisher that I had getting on 15, 18 years ago described the heyday of the modern U.S. newspaper, which is really the late 80s, early 90s, as so easy to sell advertising. The way he described it is you could pull the car up in front of a business and you didn't even have to get out. They would just come throw the money in. Why is that? And when you think about why that is, we tend to think of it as advertisers were buying ads adjacent to content, but the reality is that newspapers in the late 80s and early 90s, and even into the 2000s, really had a monopoly on being able to get a message into an individual household. Newspapers owned the printing presses, and they owned the distribution network, right? So if you had a message and you wanted to get that message to, say, a specific zip code, and you wanted to reach everybody in that zip code, the newspaper was, and really still is, if you want it delivered physically, the only way to do that, right? You buy an ad in the newspaper and you could be certain that either you were going to get on that driveway in the core newspaper or in a TMC publication, which is distributed to all households in a particular zip code, you could be sure that your message, your advertisement, whatever it was, would in fact reach that audience. And for many years, that was the only way to get to that audience in such a granular way, right? So owning the printing presses and owning the distribution network. I include the picture of the paperboy here out of a sense of nostalgia. It's been a long time since newspapers have actually used paperboys on bicycles. We still do have carriers, of course, which deliver your newspaper to your house every day, but they tend to be adults who are working part-time jobs early in the morning and they're using their cars. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more a few slides from now. But suffice it to say that there were a couple of decades, actually well over a couple of decades, where the newspaper business was a very lucrative business because it was really the only game in town when it came to delivering information, news, and advertising to people in communities throughout the nation. So what happened? Well, the internet happened, right? First there was eBay and Craigslist, and eBay and Craigslist provided a fundamental challenge to that classified section, right? Because now, instead of, when you wanted to buy a couch, instead of getting out a magnifying glass and poring over little itsy-bitsy type in the newspaper, you could hop on eBay or Craigslist and type in purple couch near me, and you'd get a list of couches with photos that you could look at. So it was much easier to search for classified type advertising via eBay or Craigslist. The migration of that advertising online really started happening in the early 2000s, early to late 2000s. And that was followed by Google and, of course, Facebook. These organizations, Google and Facebook, when you think about what they do, they distribute content to desktops. It's the electronic or digital version of that printing press and distribution network, except no printing press, no automobiles required, right? It's an electronic pipeline. So suddenly, the ability to deliver an ad to a very specific audience is no longer monopolized by newspapers. Now there's competition, right? And this is a fundamental uncoupling between that fourth estate piece that I talked about at the very beginning and the business model, that fundamental business model that made newspapers so profitable in the late 20th century and early 21st century. So what happens when newspapers face the internet? I know this is not going to be a big surprise, but sometimes it helps to see it like this. This is newspapers print circulation over the course of about the last 70 odd years. You can see that it peaked around 1990. And what you're looking at here is weekday, Sunday. Sunday is the yellow line, weekday is the red line. And then the estimates start around 2011 or 12, where there was a change in the reporting. So this data, which comes from the Pew Center for newspapers throughout the United States, includes estimates at the far end. But as somebody who has lived through this, I can tell you, these estimates are pretty spot on. You can see that print circulation started to decline gradually in the 1990s as people started to really move more toward TV and read less, but then they really declined precipitously in the latter part of the aughts, right, around the time that the Great Recession started. Here's newspapers' revenue. You can see that revenue continued to increase into the 2000s, but then around that 2007 mark, it just dropped off a cliff. The red line is the advertising line, so you can see where the migration really happened to digital, where that really started. And then that yellow line is circulation revenue, revenue that comes from subscriptions. As advertising revenue has declined, the cost of a subscription has increased. When advertising was underwriting all the news, we would basically give the newspaper away for as little as possible. Of course, we wanted to charge something because we wanted to ensure that people were that they did in fact want it and that they were in fact reading it. With less advertising, the importance of actually paying for the printing and delivery becomes more critical. That's why a newspaper subscription costs more for less newspaper these days, because more of the cost of printing and delivering is getting passed on to the actual subscriber rather than being underwritten by revenue. But as you can see from this chart, the decline in advertising revenue is not offset by the increases in circulation revenue. And this is the fundamental problem that the newspaper industry has. It's not necessarily an audience problem, as I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. It's a business model problem, right? Where we're working to find new ways to deliver advertising that really work for our advertisers, even as we're trying to shift our business to be more dependent and more supported by circulation revenue. So this is an interesting data point from the Pew Research Center This is data trending on digital newspaper audience. And what they have essentially done here is they've looked at the average monthly unique visitors to the top 50 US newspapers. Now, this is not a cumulative chart, right? This is showing that each of these 50 newspapers gets approximately this many unique monthly visitors, right? So to put this in perspective, the Mercury News topped out its print circulation at between 350 and 400,000. I've seen estimates as high as 420,000 in print in the 1990s. Now that print number is lower. It's closer to 100,000 on Sundays. However, in the last 30 days, MercuryNews.com has had more than 16 million unique visitors to its website. So that is a much bigger audience that the Mercury News has today than it ever had when it was a print-only publication, right? We have huge audience. Audience is not the problem. It's building that sustainable, stable business model, right? So where did all that money go? I don't think this is a surprise either, right? That money went online. It went primarily to Google and Facebook, which combined have 60.7% of all digital ad spending in the United States. Amazon trails with 8.6. You might want to think that Amazon is a product seller, but also a good bit of Amazon's revenue comes from advertising. And then everybody else who sells on advertising online shares that last 30.6%. So when you're thinking about that money, it's important where that advertising goes. It's important to recognize that the advertising is going to the distribution networks, not necessarily to where the content is created, right? Again, that fourth estate has become uncoupled from the revenue that once sustained it. Here's a quote from Sheryl Sandberg from a couple of years ago, where she's talking about how Facebook is a tech company that doesn't hire engineers, doesn't hire reporters, etc. I include this in this deck because often when I'm giving presentations to people, back in the old days when these would be physical meetings and I'd be standing in front of a room full of people, I would ask people to raise their hands if they got their news from Facebook, or raise their hands if they got their news from Google. And generally, most of the hands in the room would go up because people think that they get news from Facebook or Google. And then I would follow up later by asking, so how many of you have ever seen a reporter that works for Facebook or a reporter that works for Google? And the answer is nobody, because neither Facebook nor Google hires any reporters. They do, however, have initiatives that are intended to help publishers. Google has NewsLab, which is a somewhat robust and legitimate effort to help newspapers figure out how to reach more audience and have better tools at delivering content to their audiences. Facebook has an accelerator program where they contribute grant money to news organizations. The Mercury News, for example, has benefited from funding from the Google News Initiative. One of the things that you're actually going to see on the other slide, on the next slide, is a premium tier digital subscription product that we plan to offer, that we're building to offer to readers. The development of that has been funded in part by funding that we received from Google. What you've seen in newspapers over the course of the last 10 years is a pivot to digital. And I use the word pivot somewhat tongue-in-cheek, because if you follow the industry trades, you'll see that every year or two, there is a pivot to something, a pivot to video, a pivot to blogs, a pivot to whatever. We're always pivoting to the next thing. But when it really comes down to it, there are a couple of key things that our industry has been doing to stabilize and drive business. So in the advertising sphere, we sell advertising, of course, on our own sites. So there on the left, you see MercuryNews.com. We also have Ad Taxi, which essentially is an advertising agency. Our Ad Taxi team can sell advertising campaigns that run not only on our core websites, but also include search and social and programmatic or exchange advertising. And then we have a Convertly team that specializes in helping our advertising clients build their own websites and host their websites. So it's kind of an ongoing digital presence that they would help a potential advertiser create. So those are very innovative things that our advertising department has been doing and is doing. Our VP of Sales and Marketing, Michael Turpin, is a member of this group, and I I think I saw him on this Zoom meeting. I'm sure many of you guys know him, and he can tell you lots more about these things. One of the more recent things that we have been doing is we have started charging for access to our websites, which arguably is something that the newspaper industry should have done 15 or 20 years ago. I'm not sure it would have worked 15 or 20 years ago. There are case studies of news organizations that attempted to charge for subscriptions earlier in the 21st century and were not successful at doing it. The Mercury News was in fact one of those publications that had a paywall many years ago and took it down because it was having not having the effect on it was not driving the subscriptions, and it was depressing traffic too much. Over the last couple of years, we have taken on that strategy anew and found that it is far more effective now than it has been in the past. So what you see here in these boxes is the different options that one would have in subscribing to our newspaper publications. There's the unlimited digital access, which gives you unlimited access to our website. The ad-free digital access is the premium tier that I talked about just a few minutes ago. The ad-free aspect of that, what that means is essentially there is less advertising on the core website, but it's really an enhanced user experience that gives you a more attractive site design that loads more quickly. It also has location awareness built into it, where it will serve news based on where you happen to be. And we're currently in development on an enhanced commenting platform that we hope will improve the quality of the comments that people leave on our stories and also make that user experience more delightful for the people who are engaging in it. And then, of course, there's print. People still love print. Print, no matter what you may hear, and despite the slides that you've seen previously, is still a significant portion of our business and is still very much enjoyed by many, many people, probably many of you who are on this presentation. I should note that we have come a long way in shifting our business away from being as heavily dependent on advertising as it was in the past. Circulation revenue these days is about half of our total revenue, and the digital revenue streams are steadily gaining through the on-site advertising, the agency advertising, and of course the Convertly site building and hosting. However, we are still disproportionately dependent on print, and that brings us to where we are today in the time of coronavirus. We've continued to operate during the shutdowns, news being an essential service, but the downturn or the shutdowns have led to a severe downturn in advertising that's really impacted our operations. Like everybody else, we're primarily working from home. Like many other businesses, we're suffering revenue losses, and we've had to take some unpleasant actions such as some layoffs and furloughs that we're continuing to do as our advertising continues to struggle. We hope that as the economy recovers and the government begins to open up, or the economy begins to open up, we see that advertising decline, but it is a very real and immediate problem for us. Other newspapers around the country similarly affected, in some cases worse. Some places have seen advertising fall off as much as 70%. There are other places that have laid off a far larger portion of their staff than we have, or cut content, and in some cases shut down. I think what you're seeing is that news publications that are more heavily dependent on advertising have been more severely affected. So think of your free weeklies that survive entirely on advertising. Those publications are really, really hit hard by the coronavirus shutdowns, whereas publications such as the Mercury News, which have a pretty robust subscriber base, are still severely affected, but not quite so badly affected. And then in addition to the coronavirus, one of the things that is coming down the pipe is AB5, which took effect earlier this year, but there was a separate bill that suspended the implementation for newspaper carriers until January 2021. When that takes place, when we have to start doing the ABC test to determine whether carriers can be independent contractors, it's likely that they will have to become employees, which will increase our delivery costs by as much as 30%. That is a really difficult pill to swallow for an industry that is already struggling. And in the wake of the coronavirus, is likely to have pretty severe consequences for the newspaper industry. And I will close by noting that publishers throughout California have banded together under the auspices of the California News Publishers Association to lobby lawmakers to, one, streamline access to grant or loan funding that would set off the impact of the coronavirus, or that would offset the impact of the coronavirus. Two, to institutionalize some form of relief from AB 5 to exempt newspaper carriers from that ABC test. And three, to provide some form of advertising related to government outreach and public awareness. So, in summary, what I intend to convey here is that the problem that newspapers face, generally speaking, prior to coronavirus and AB 5, is a business model issue. In fact, when we initially talked about me giving this presentation, the majority of what I intended to talk to you about was that business model issue. The AB 5 and the coronavirus pieces that came later. Some have speculated, and I think rightly, that these crises are forcing the traditional legacy news media to face immediately what they might otherwise have had to deal with over the next 3 to 5 years. So that can be a period of pretty wrenching change. It's certainly going to be challenging, but as always, we're very committed to meeting these challenges head on and to continuing to serve the people of the Bay Area as we have for 120 years since or 170 years since the Mercury News was founded in 1851. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have about these things that I have talked about already or anything else.
Okay, Frank, well, thank you very much. I have 3 different questions having to do with the content of your Mercury News. So let me just give you those 3 different questions as one question. One, what does the Mercury feel its responsibility is in reporting this simmering issue of climate change that, you know, we know that it's going to affect our lives, and do you feel a responsibility to do more reporting on that? The second content question has to do with business reporting. We're in the heart of major business in America, and does the Mercury try to do greater coverage than they're currently doing? And third, we're noticing that there are a lot of obits running from different areas, and we know that obits are paid for, but that seems to take away from the news coverage. So those are the 3 content questions having to do with climate change, business coverage, and obits.
Okay, definitely climate change is a very important issue that we at the newspaper take very seriously. You can expect continued coverage of climate change. I am thinking that this question is motivated by a sense that we should do more on that, or the questioner would not have asked. So that's definitely a suggestion I'll take back to the newsroom. But my answer is yes, climate change is important, and it is one of the biggest issues that we as a people will face in coming years. So definitely we want to continue covering that.
Right.
Business is interesting. So at Bay Area News Group, one of the things that we have been thinking about over the last couple of years is what are the defining issues of the Bay Area, and we have kind of settled on real estate and housing as a house story. And I'm sure you're aware, if you follow the paper, much of the reporting we've done in that area. We think that real estate and housing is inextricably linked to business in the Bay Area. We have kind of covered business through that prism, but over the last, 8 weeks, as times have changed and we recognize that we're heading into a very volatile economy, we have started to have conversations about what will our business coverage look like going forward. Obviously, there have been changes to the print newspaper stemming from coronavirus coverage. You'll notice, for example, that the sports section is smaller because there are no sporting events. We added a page of puzzles for things so that people would have something to do while they're stuck at home. And then the back of that section is the business pages. One of the conversations we've been having is, given the increasing importance of business in the economy, is that really the right place for the business pages? Should there be more business-related content? Should there be more economy-related content? So that's a conversation that's ongoing in the newsroom right now. Look for us to be exploring ways that we can expand, enhance, and play up our business coverage, especially as the quarantines continue and as the economy starts to open up. This natural tension between public safety and economic well-being is something that we are talking about all the time and trying to figure out what is the most thoughtful way to cover that and to relate the public debate over those sometimes conflicting interests. And that will continue to go on. Obits, since obits are paid, obits are not taking away from news. The more obits we have, the more that helps us because it underwrites news hole elsewhere in the paper. So when you're seeing more obituaries, don't feel like they're crowding out news. We want more obituaries, not fewer obituaries. And I say that with a grain of salt because we never, you know, of course, want to see people die. But when it does happen, we would like that to be recognized in our publications. Does that make sense? I don't want to sound crass in wanting obituary advertising, but it's not crowding out news.
I have a question. Hasn't one of the biggest shifts affecting newspapers been the shift in ownership from family-run companies grounded in journalism and public service to hedge fund and investment funds with no background or little interest in journalism?
So Bay Area News Group is owned by Media News Group, which is controlled by a hedge fund. I think you all know that. The move away from private ownership in news organizations occurred largely throughout the course of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, most newspapers were owned by some sort of corporation. The Mercury News, for example, was a Knight Ridder paper, and then a Media News Group paper before Media News Group filed for bankruptcy and was taken over by a hedge fund. Hedge funds are a result of the business model problem, not the cause of the business model problem. One of the things that we're seeing in the industry right now, however, and this is kind of you can think about it as kind of coming full circle, right? Newspapers in the United States started out being very small, very politically and civic-minded, owned by local individuals who often had a political point of view that they wanted to espouse or a goal that they wanted to make sure was communicated or conveyed. What we're seeing now is smaller, in some cases nonprofit news organizations cropping up that are covering niche subjects and topics, often which are funded by organizations that want to advance a certain ideology. I think we can expect that we're going to see more of that. We're going to see more smaller, narrowly focused news organizations, even as the larger chains and companies try to figure out how to build those business models. Right now, the only big company that has really crossed over, as they say, right, switched its business from the old ad-supported model entirely over to a subscription-supported model is the New York Times, right, which is doing really well these days. Everybody else is struggling to some degree. I think that being owned by a private equity company, their goal is to make money. My goal as the editor is to do the journalism, right? And so the interactions that I'm having with them are typically around how is your journalism resulting in a more stable business model that is going to be secure going into the future, and less on, you know, what specifically have you guys done to ensure the government is accountable to the people. But that tends to be, you know, they tend to have an expectation that the editorial departments will do that, and that's why they're our editors. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And there's a follow-up question to that. Are there standard ways or metrics used to judge the quality of news content?
Well, we measure everything that we do in some way or another. And we can look at an individual story or a type of story and see how many people are reading that story. Are those people local people or not local people? What is the likelihood that those people are to subscribe? Now, metrics and measuring things in news has changed a lot over the course of the last 10 years, and even more so once we started charging for content online. And what people will click on for free is very different than what they will subscribe to, right? So if you're just trying to drive page views, you just want people to come to the site and consume a bunch of pages, it's a different type of content than if you want people to come back again and again and again and be a loyal audience. And it is gratifying to find that the loyal audience tends to come to the stories that we most traditionally believe have value, the enterprise and the investigative reporting, the local news reporting. Those are the things that are really sticky. Things that drive page views tend to be the more sensational types of crime stories. You might get a lot of people who come and read that story, but then they leave and they don't necessarily come back, right? So that has encouraged us to invest in more of the local reporting, more of the enterprise and investigative reporting, and less of the sensational flash in the pan reporting.
Okay. You spoke about the hard copy newspaper is still a major portion of what the Mercury News is doing. I have two questions about the hard copy paper. One, what has been the difference in distribution to the home 5 years ago and up till now? What has the difference been? Is that holding steady or is that on decline? And two, is it safe for us to read the newspaper with COVID-19?
Print circulation has been declining for many years because more people are getting it online and we're better at delivering it online, and the models for getting it online continue to improve. Even over the last 10 years, it's gone from being something that you would primarily read on your desktop to something that you can now read on your phone or tablet, and the user experience on your phone or tablet is really good. So in part, that is what's driving the decline in print circulation. Again, overall audience across platforms bigger than it's ever been before, but print circulation still declining. Nevertheless, print circulation still very lucrative for us, and print advertising very lucrative for us and very important. And they're important because they work. The ads work, and having something in the paper, it reaches an audience, and a very important audience that is paying attention not only to what's happening in the news, but to what's happening in their communities, right? People who read print newspapers tend to be people who are civic-minded, civically engaged. They're voters. They're people who own homes. They're invested in their local economies. The print newspaper, I'm not aware of a single instance of somebody who's contracted coronavirus from handling a print newspaper. The CDC says that it is very unlikely that you will contract coronavirus from handling a product such as a newspaper that's delivered to your home. Nevertheless, we have followed the CDC guidelines and the WHO guidelines very carefully. We've sanitized our distribution centers, and we're monitoring for anything we can do to make sure that the newspaper is safe when it is delivered to your home. So I think you should not be worried about getting a print newspaper. I still get many print newspapers at my home, 2 a day and 4 on Sunday.
Okay, Frank, I have a final question and then a final comment. The final question is, have you been able to determine what the sustained attack on mainstream media how that has affected subscriptions? If you know,
that's a really interesting question. So, all right, as David noted at the beginning of this, I have newspapers in Southern California as well, and the readership of the Mercury News is very different than the readership of, say, the Orange County Register, which Orange County is traditionally more conservative. The readers there are more likely to challenge the reporting that appears in the newspaper. A lot of our reporting of national and international events comes from the Associated Press or the New York Times, right? Neither the Mercury News nor the Register staffs Washington, D.C. or has bureaus overseas. We rely on wire services to provide these stories. there is a certain segment of the readership that does not have faith or confidence in the Associated Press or the New York Times and the reporting that emanates from those services about politics. So these last 4 years have been very different in terms of the interactions that I've had with readers than the previous 21 years of my career, right? I probably get more angry emails and phone calls in a week than I used to get in a year. And the level of anger is much, much, much higher now than it ever was before, right? Including, I mean, including at one point having letters that were sent to one of my offices investigated by the FBI because they were opened by an assistant who was scared by what she found in the letter. That's unprecedented, right? It's a total different world. We monitor our stops very carefully. We want to know why people are canceling the paper or canceling a digital subscription. There are people who are canceling because of politics, and when you say the sustained attack on the media, I attribute that's politics, right? But even in the places where it's loudest, the number of people canceling is not, it's extraordinary in the sense that it's different from normal, but it's not so high as to be alarming. Most people just like to call and yell at me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They don't actually cancel their subscriptions. They feel better when they get to tell me that they don't like what we reported.
Well, Frank, it's just been great to have you here today, and I thank you very much for shifting the way we do things and coming on to Zoom. We want you to know that Sal Pizarro is a member of our club, and we use him on a regular basis to tell us what's going on around town. And we love the Mercury, and part of the reason is we love Sal Pizarro's columns and the local color that he brings. So thank you for letting Sal do his great job. It's really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It was delightful to be here. Happy to come back anytime you want me. And also on the topic of that save local journalism, the publisher or CNPA would be happy to come talk to you at some point if you would like to do that. Just let me know, and we're happy to be here for you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your support of the Mercury News.
Great. Let's unmute and give them, everyone unmute, give them a big hand.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yay.